Ladies, gentlemen, if everybody could take their seats, the show's about to begin. For the first time, I think I've ever been behind a lectern, I'm actually going to read the introductions because I've got a lot to say. I'm going to try and say it in a short period of time, and I want to get these guys on stage. I'm Dave Noss, founder and principal of Equity West Investment Partners here in Denver, and I have the privilege of introducing two industry icons. They've taken time out from their extraordinarily busy schedules to attend the CU Real Estate Center's 17th Annual Forum. Jeff and Sam, thank you for accepting our invitation. I think I can speak for the Center and all of its members in saying that we are very proud to have you here and could not be more grateful for your participation. I'm equally grateful for the honor to introduce each of you. Jeff DeBoer is the founding president and CEO of the Real Estate Roundtable. The Real Estate Roundtable brings leaders of the nation's top 150 publicly held and privately owned real estate owners whose real estate holdings approach nearly $2 trillion. That's a lot of capital. And development, lending, and management firms together with the leaders of national real estate trade associations to jointly address key national policy issues in our nation's capital. Under Jeff's leadership, the Roundtable seeks to ensure a cohesive industry voice is heard by government officials and the public about real estate and its important role in both the national and global economy. Jeff also serves as chairman of the National Real Estate Organizations, and on the important matters relating, which are important to all of us, building security, terrorist threats, and incident reporting, Jeff serves as chairman of the Real Estate Information Sharing and Analysis Center. Jeff has been a guest on Fox News, Bloomberg Television, and CNBC. His editorials have been published in the Wall Street Journal and USA Today. He has a law degree from Washington Lee University. Jeff, thank you for joining us. Since I worked for Sam Zell for nearly 14 years, Sherm's given me just a little extra time to introduce him. I hope to provide some non-public insight into a very public persona that Sam is. But before I tell you some things that you don't know about Sam, let me extol his virtues by telling you some of the things that you may already know about him. Sam founded and is the chairman of Equity Group Investments, for which the last 40 years he's had invested interests not just in the United States, but all over the world, and not just real estate, but many industries. He's also the founder and chairman of Equity International, a private investment firm focused on real estate-related businesses in emerging markets, which include having taken public the largest home builder in Mexico and the largest retail property owner in Brazil. He's the chairman of 4 other public New York Stock Exchange-traded companies, including Equity Residential, the largest apartment real estate investment trust in the United States. Sam is recognized as the founding father of today's public real estate industry, and you can surely see why. Among Sam's additional activities, far too many to list here, is his clearly demonstrated commitment to education, which I thought, given this university-sponsored event, that the audience might have an interest in. And to make you aware, Sam graduated not from CU, but with both an undergraduate and a law degree from the University of Michigan, and has demonstrated his loyalty to his alma mater by serving on the President's Advisory Board and by establishing the Zell Entrepreneurial Center at the University of Michigan's Business School. Sam's also endowed the Zell Real Estate Center at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, and also endowed Northwestern University Center for Risk Management. And I assume that was of interest to you. I am certain it must be of interest to CU's foundation, if you're following my drift. I wish I had time to tell you a longer story about Sam's history, but let me say that if I had to guess, knowing Sam as I do, he got his heart from his mother, Rochelle, and he got his gift for seeing around corners, for being decisive, and for being a contrarian from his father, Bernard. Despite Sam's father beseeching all extended family members to emigrate with Bernard, his father, and his mother, and his sister Julie, Sam's sister, in 1939, at his father's insistence, they were the only family members to leave Poland 13 hours before the Germans bombed the railways that prevented any further exits. The rest of the family, extended family, was never heard from again. I'd say that was pretty decisive decision-making, and one that I might say was also well-timed. Sam has a history of following suit. Then in true Zell fashion, Bernard took the family, not like other countrymen who perished, west, but east, safely through Lithuania, Russia, and Japan. And then Sam was in the womb. Sam Zell built the largest real estate company in the country, Equity Office Properties, which he sold with prescient timing to the Blackstone Group in 2007 for $39 billion. When I joined the company, we had 4 million square feet and 13 employees. The company grew into the largest cap real estate stock in the New York Stock Exchange, owned 120 million square feet of office space, and had 3,200 employees. Sam created culture that facilitated that type of growth. He made it fun. He was always encouraging you to test your limits. His door was literally never closed. It was always open, and it is to this day. You could be irreverent with your compatriots, but not disrespectful. A thoughtful risk taker, but not disobedient. You listened, you learned. You couldn't be self-righteous. Sam didn't care whether you were right. He cared if you knew what you didn't know. If you thought you had all the answers, all you had to do was visit with Sam. Conversations with Sam were always direct and to the point, if not succinct, but you were never left confused about which direction to go. Many dialogue with Sam ended with him saying, "Am I being too subtle?" By way of example, very early on, I mentioned to Sam, in light of my seemingly low starting salary, that I might be somewhat underpaid. Very casually and without hesitation, Sam said, "Well, David, let me explain it to you this way. You get to wear blue jeans to the office, you're surrounded by a bunch of smart people, and you get access to me. How do you feel now?" I said, "Sam, I think I might be slightly overcompensated." I have one other story to tell you of local interest, which will make Sam cringe a bit, but I'm going to tell it anyway. We'd acquired Mickey Miller's office portfolio here in Denver, and Sam had invited Mickey and Jimmy and those close to the transaction to his home in downtown Denver. He had to excuse himself as the host after dinner and fly, as I remember, to Miami for a breakfast morning meeting, and he encouraged his guests to linger, which we did. As we left, I turned a curvilinear wall prematurely, and if you can believe it, knocked off a box of art that his wife, Helen, had given him onto the floor. I was, of course, and by the way, it was not in terrific shape. I was, of course, aghast, so I called his longtime assistant, Joey, the next morning, and I said, "I need to talk to Sam." She got Sam on the phone, and I can literally remember every dialogue of that conversation, or every piece of that dialogue to this day. "Good morning, David," as Sam would always start every conversation. And notice who initiated it. It was Sam. "Good morning, Sam. Sam, I am so terribly sorry. I knocked a piece of art off the wall last night. It's the one that Helen gave you. I'm aware of that." "Well, Sam, I just, I don't know what to do. I just feel so terrible. Can I call Helen to apologize?" "That would only compound the problem," said Sam. Okay. "Well, Sam, I don't know what to tell you. I feel awful. What would you like me to do?" "I'd like you to be more careful the next time you come to dinner at my home." "Well, thank you, Sam. You're welcome, David. Goodbye, David. Goodbye, Sam." That's almost literal, I think, to this day. I can tell you the conversation with the art insurer from the Chicago Art Museum later that afternoon was a lot less user-friendly. So despite his successes publicly, if you can't tell, I've experienced Sam to be compassionate, caring, and considerate privately. I hope I've been helpful in some way for you to see what differentiates the public man you've known as a real estate mogul, an industrialist, and a global entrepreneur. I was asked not long ago, given the challenge of competing in today's real estate world, if I would ever consider going to work for someone again, and I said, I don't know, but if I do, I can only think of one. You're about to meet him. Jeff and Sam, on with the show.
Well, thank you. That was something, Sam. I learned a lot there. I didn't know that. Look at this picture. Did you see that picture of the two of us up there, Sam? It was the icon and the eye candy. Look at that. The icon and the eye candy.
You need to learn to smile.
Well, I know, but it's tough. It's tough. That picture, though, does remind me, you and I have seen a lot of articles. I work in Washington, so they're always writing about public policy. You're obviously a leader in the business world, so you see headlines on business. But one headline in the Wall Street Journal I think we both agree with. A couple of years ago, they had this great headline, and it said, "Bald is powerful," right? That was a good one.
You bet.
So today we're going to talk about everything, Sam. I mean, you are, obviously in the introduction, you're you're a lawyer, you're a businessman, you're an investor, you're an owner, you're the chairman of everything, the CEO of nothing. And so we're going to talk about all that. Investment trends, interest rates, the world. We're going to talk a little about DC real estate Denver real estate markets, the world real estate markets. But it is the University of Colorado. And maybe a couple just quick thoughts, your reflections. I mean, today at lunch when you visited with these students, it was really fascinating. And your thoughts about education, maybe a couple of words about what you recall from your education at the University of Michigan or something, maybe some mentors, and how you learn. I found it very interesting, your reading habits and how you learn things. So maybe let's start with that, and then we'll drift into the economy and get into markets and things people really want to focus on.
In answer, somebody asked me a question earlier today, and I answered it by explaining that I'm a voracious reader. I mean, the idea that I'm sitting up here without something to read is kind of against my nature. And somehow or other, and I can't explain it, I've developed the ability to read and, quote, seek out anomalies. If you read as much as I do, things start to follow patterns. And then something peculiar happens, and something gets entered into the equation that doesn't fit. I mean, I gave the example about the fact that I've been reading all this stuff, and I had numerous repetitious references to Williston, South Dakota. And I looked it up, and Williston was 20,000 people. And I just couldn't figure out why it kept coming up in my reading. And obviously the Bakken Shale and all that stuff, but still, I basically got on a plane and went to see it. And from that, emanated a lot of other things. But that's just kind of typical. I went to India in 2003 because outsourcing kept coming up in my reading. And I didn't understand it, so I had to go see it. I think philosophically, I've always been someone who has to go see it. I think that part of the definition of an entrepreneur is an extraordinary observer. I've never met an entrepreneur who wasn't a very good observer, because it's those observations that all come together and lead to conclusions. And so I try my best to be as knowledgeable as possible, and yet try and do the best I can to not clog my capabilities with information that useless isn't the right word, but maybe conventional and doesn't really give me a perspective.
Do you study every day, Sam?
Study? I don't know what the word study means, but I read, a book and a half of escapist fiction a week. I read 5 newspapers, probably 10 magazines a week. I read all kinds of writings by various savants, all of which contributes to have the ability to have an opinion.
It's in my role. I think I have the best job other than yours in the world, and that is because I get to deal with the most optimistic people in the United States. People in real estate, so optimistic, entrepreneurs. Your comments on optimism and just how you get ahead in the business world being optimistic.
Well, first of all, I think optimism is a condition. I think I think being optimistic is just a wonderful gift that unfortunately not everybody has. And if you are optimistic and you can see the silver lining rather than the black cloud, I think it gives you self-confidence and makes you a more effective player. On the other hand, as an investor, I'm keenly aware of the risks of too much optimism. Every time we have a cycle in real estate, we see the guys laying by the road who were too optimistic. I tend to think that they weren't so much too optimistic as they didn't quantify the downside. I think that from my perspective, I start every potential investment focused on what's the downside. And frankly, from my opinion, from my perspective, if we do a deal and we identify the downside and we're correct, then I view that as a successful endeavor, even if the transaction didn't work. You got to remember that they pay guys $25 million a year to get a hit 1 out of 3 times. I would be broke if I were successful only 1 out of 3 times. On the other hand, you fire the bank loan officer who never has a loss, because that means he isn't taking risk. So I think our perspective is to be right 70 or 75% of the time. But of greater importance is to understand the degree to which we were wrong in the other 30 and build that into the way we think and the way we take risk.
So you take risk, you know you're not going to hit 1,000, but you're going to take the risk and see where it goes. I testified about 10 days ago before Congress on some issues, and one of the senators asked me a question about how do people in the real estate view the economy today? What are they concerned about? What are their number one headwinds? What are people concerned about? And from my perspective, and I'd like you to react to my answer, because I said, look, our industry is sort of stabilized a little bit. We're ready to lead the economy again, the way that we historically have. I think as you look at comebacks in the economy, real estate's always at the forefront. And when you look at a downturn, real estate's always sort of leading that. I think we're in a position to lead it. But what's going to happen on interest rates? When will they increase? Under what conditions will they increase? Will they increase with wage inflation and fundamentals, or will they not? What's going to happen on tax reform? Will it be an anti-risk-taking, anti-capital formation tax reform, or will it be positive? What's going to happen on this issue called terrorism risk insurance that provides cover for people to finance their buildings? These things are things that in Washington I look at, but you might look around the world and see other things that are much more of a headwind or a tailwind for the economy. For example, what's happening in the Ukraine or the Middle East or other things.
Yeah, I think, Jeff, that if I had been in your shoes when this guy asked the question, I would have answered and said that the real estate business, more than anything else, is looking for growth in the economy. When it's all said and done, if we all go outside right now, we won't find any desks in the street or people sleeping in the street. So somehow or other, the supply-demand scenario for real estate in Denver today is relatively in balance. The question is, so what's the incentive for building anything? What's the incentive for remodeling anything, extending the real estate business? And it's all dependent on growth and growth of the economy. I think I'd also point out to that guy that there's a basic conflict between growth and, in effect, quote, spreading out and redistribution of wealth, which has been a theme of the current administration. The reality, from my perspective, is if you're redistributing wealth, you can't create growth. And I think that that's a basic misunderstanding that exists today. Because if, in fact, we cannot produce growth, we've just seen, Japan for the last 15 years living through a non-growth period. If you were in the real estate business, not much got built because there was relatively little demand. I think the question for America is, Are we going to be able to go back to a reasonable 2.5 to 3.5% growth rate in the future? I think that is what this country needs to grow, prosper, and lead the rest of the world. If we, instead of focusing on how we grow our economy, focus on theoretical discrepancies between the rich and the poor, and we, bring in envy as just another mortal sin, I think we're going to be sitting here 5 years from now, and the subject matter is, why didn't the real estate market recover? Why isn't there growth? Why aren't they building new buildings?
Yeah, you sort of sit back and you say, well, where's the demand going to come from? If you're in the office sector or any sector really, where is the new demand? We've sort of seen the tech situation. We saw a variety of parts of our economy leap forward that created demand and created. Where do you think? I mean, you're optimistic. You look ahead. Where's that demand going to come from? Do you think?
I think before you can answer that question, I think you have to address what's the policy in Washington. I live in Chicago, and I don't have to suffer through the kind of stuff that you're suffering through. But I just don't see the growth leadership. And without growth leadership, I think we have a very significant risk of stagnation. People ask me about the economy today, and my answer is I think it's benign, meaning that it's not, quote, going down, but I don't see where it's growing. I think we are beginning to approach what I'll call an additional new era of where technology doesn't necessarily translate into more employment. So when Instagram was sold for $1 billion to Facebook, they had 13 employees. Last week, WhatsApp was sold to Facebook. I think it was Facebook, for $19 billion. WhatsApp has 55 employees. So if 19 billion is the productivity of 55 employees, how the hell are we going to employ the rest of America? We've been sitting around watching all of these protests and all this discussion about the minimum wage. The naivete of the discussions are really frightening, because the reality is that every fast food place in America will place robots instead of people to take your orders and to flip the hamburgers, and we will have lost vast amounts of entry-level jobs, entry-level experiences. I just think that this focus on quote, the bottom half and the taken care of, this country would be a lot better off if the $1 trillion that was the original stimulus bill had actually been spent to stimulate the country, instead of spent for extended unemployment benefits and extended union things in the municipal area. I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
I mean,
Sam, knowing you a little bit as I do, I think it's clear there obviously are problems at the lower end, and those problems should be addressed. But the way that they're being addressed by sort of penalizing or inhibiting growth at the upper end instead of figuring out how to stimulate the lower end is sort of the way that I would look at it. And I think perhaps
but
that's
what we're really talking about is, what is it that built this country? This country was built on aspiration. The aspiration of all of our people. The aspiration of all of those immigrants who came and were given another shot, another experience. If we lose that aspiration, if we lose that motivation, then we're going to end up like Western Europe. And I don't think that's a particularly attractive resolution.
or France without the good cheese.
That's right. Or the wine.
Yep. There you go. Well, we have California wine.
That's true.
So, Sam, you started, or one of your early business endeavors concerned buying distressed debt. And you made a lot of money out of it, and you made quite a play on it. Now we've got about $1.5 trillion worth of commercial mortgage-backed securities that sort of have to work their way. A lot of these loans were originated 06, 07, high values, high loan-to-values on them, and now they're coming due. And so that, pig has to go through the python today, so to speak.
But it's important to remember they're coming due for the second time. The first time, we applied pretend and extend.
We just kicked them
We
down.
just went like this and say, hope it'll be better next time.
Right. And in some cases it is, but time has helped some. But how do you feel about all this debt that's coming due? Is that a big concern of yours, or is it an optimistic thing for you? Do you see an opportunity there?
Well, the levels of debt that are coming due are obviously would benefit from the fact that interest rates are materially lower today than they were when those loans were made. On the other hand, and particularly in the office space arena, the office space market in 05 and 06 and is much, much, much stronger than it is today. And so despite the fact that we've had some recovery, we've had recovery in multifamily housing, we've had some recovery in single family, we've had relatively little recovery in the office space market, and it connects to the fact that we're using our space differently. And I mean, in 1980, I went to Hong Kong for the first time, and I visited a friend of mine, and he had an operation there, and he had 90 square feet per employee. And I had just come from the United States, where the average was 250 square feet per employee. And I looked at that, I never forget, and I said, wow, that's coming our way. Turned out it took a lot longer for it to come our way, but it's coming our way big time. And the result is that almost every major release in major metropolitan areas in the last few years have seen office space requirements decrease rather than increase. Almost every law firm lease that's gone on in New York City in the last 3 years has been for less space than they previously occupied. We're seeing that all over the country in all kinds of usages. So the result is that other than a special situation in New York and maybe a special situation in San Francisco, we've had, think about it, since 07, we have had very, very little new supply. And primarily because the economics don't work. So I think that you got to look at this stuff, you got to look at the office markets, you got to decide whether there are opportunities to grow. But again, it comes right back to growth, employment, jobs, and we're sitting here today, and we have the least number of people employed in the United States in history.
Yeah. On the office sector, no building, really no building to speak of since 07, 08. Yep. And then we've got, pretty frothy markets, particularly on the coast, concerning valuation in the office sector, but in other product types too. Driven, I think, but you tell me, driven by financing, driven by people are finding value in financing as opposed to finding value in fundamentals. Yeah, and I just wonder how you feel about, the interest rates.
I'm not sure I agree with you. I don't think the word financing is correct. I think liquidity is the right word. And, we have an extraordinary level of liquidity worldwide. We also have an extraordinary shortage of income emanating from brick and mortar. The result of those two things is that any existing stream of income is today generating a premium over any historical basis because there is such a shortage of any kind of income. I mean, think about it. You buy a CD day. I don't own any CDs, but I don't think you get more than 1.5 or
If you're lucky.
if you're lucky. So we used to say, gee, if you're going to build and buy an office building, you ought to get a 8% return. Well, if you can only get 1.5 from a savings account, and you look at a stream of income out of an office building, and it's, let's say, 5, compared to what? And ultimately, everything, all investments have to
A couple
compete.
of things come to mind, all those comments, sort of liquidity, all this capital that's out there. And yet in Washington, one of the things that I've been trying to do concerns reducing the barrier that the United States has erected regarding foreign capital coming into U.S. real estate equities. And we've been arguing for some time that this should be changed for a variety of reasons. We think it's unfair vis-a-vis other industries. The pharmaceutical industry is owned about 20% by foreign owners. Cars, the auto industry, 15%, manufacturing, about 30%. U.S. real estate, about 2%. And there's some other reasons, so we've been working to bring that barrier down. But then, you've got people that say, Jeff, why are you working on that? Because we have plenty of equity in the U.S. real estate markets.
Until you don't.
Until you don't.
Until you don't.
It works until it doesn't.
That's correct. And I just think that your 2% number may be right, although I would think that the impact of foreign capital in the U.S. real estate market is significantly greater than 2%.
Certainly in New York and residential, it's unbelievable.
New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles,
Right.
Dallas, Houston, Miami. I mean, there's just an enormous amount of foreign capital in real estate. I think your 2% number is probably much more related to the public format and not so in the private sector.
Yeah.
But, liquidity is value. And ultimately, you have no value if you have no liquidity. And you have value if you have liquidity. And, there have been various times in my career where I've been through numerous cycles. And probably the one that reminded me the most was in 1992, where Forbes said I had a net worth of about $1.5 billion, and I was worried about whether I was going to be able to make payroll on Friday. The answer was I had all these wonderful assets, and they were worth a lot of money, except they weren't relevant if I didn't have liquidity. And so when it's all said and done, that's always been a standard of everything is liquidity equals value. And the U.S. Represents an opportunity for people from all over the world to seek safety. Their desire to do that is much more today than it was 10 years ago. And I think it's likely to be more so as the United States moves forward and as we move forward.
You've always, I think, and you've said this publicly, go left when other people go right, find opportunities when other people see barriers or risks. You early on talked about liquefying real estate, putting it into a public format in the 90s. Later in the 90s, sort of globally, taking real estate and liquefying it globally. So looking forward, let's say 10 years from now, what's the real estate industry look like? It's hard to look in a crystal ball.
Yeah.
And
In 1990 or 1992, the public real estate market in the United States was $7 billion. Today, the public real estate market is $700 billion. If I were to, asked to make a guess, I would guess that 10 years from now, that number would likely to be $1.5 billion. I mean, would likely to be $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion, as more and more real estate becomes equitized and becomes part of the public markets. I see the same kind of thing happening worldwide. I mean, in 1997, after we finished creating the modern REIT era in the United States, we then turned around and said, the emerging markets have to learn how to equitize real estate because too much of their future is buried in illiquid assets, particularly land. And so we, in effect, started creating public vehicles outside of the United States in emerging markets. And you just have to understand the benefit these countries get when you take $1 billion of illiquid land and turn it into $1 billion of securities or liquid assets that dramatically help the growth of the country. So I think that's a theme that has always been the case. I think we proved it in the early 90s. The continued growth suggests that we're going to continue to see more and more equitization. And almost by definition, the more equitization, the more liquidity.
So that's a segue into, so what's your investment philosophy today in the U.S. regarding real estate and internationally regarding the emerging markets? We've got the EU still struggling with their debt situation. We have Japan sort of hanging on. You know, you were active, very active in Brazil and other parts of Latin America. What's Sam Zell going to do now?
I think that the U.S. market, I think I described it recently as benign. We're missing the animal instincts. We're missing the super motivation. Maybe we're missing the overly optimistic developers. But I think they're all responding to a relatively weak...
The overly optimistic developers went out when everything went public.
That's true.
Those guys were the private guys, remember?
Yeah. But I think that the U.S. market is interesting. I think it's a market of individual opportunities. This is not a 1994 where all the boats were rising and the country was growing and the real estate market was recovering. I think this is much more a sharpshooter environment, picking the spots where, in effect, there are reasons for demand. In the same manner, our international investments have the same kind of orientation. So when the Fukushima disaster occurred in Japan, the impact of that, which really has been very little written about, but a lot has happened, was that it disrupted the supply chains of worldwide manufacturers. Most people don't think about it, but Japan manufactures massive amounts of stuff that that's exported to China and goes into the final production of Chinese merchandise that may be sold to us. Fukushima happened, and there was just an enormous hole in the distribution and the supply chain. And everybody managed to cover their rear ends in one form or another, but it was very expensive to a lot of companies. The result of which has been that almost every company that was totally manufacturing in the Far East, and particularly China, have been working on secondary sourcing, something that they kind of forgot about and were comfortable to totally rely on China. Not anymore. One of the biggest beneficiaries of that is Mexico, and particularly southwest Mexico near the Verde border, the Verde port. That's becoming the manufacturing center of Mexico, and creating secondary operating facilities for companies that also manufacture in the Far East. So we've in effect gone in there and we've made some major investments in both land and buildings and in developing office and industrial, and particularly industrial for kind of mid-sized companies that are servicing Bombardier and Volkswagen and these huge international companies that are manufacturing there. In the same manner, we're currently developing office and industrial in Colombia. It's been a phenomenal experience. The demand is extraordinary. It's very much impacted by the fact that the United States passed a free trade agreement with Colombia. And so a lot of these multinationals who didn't have a stake in the ground in Colombia are currently going there, and therefore the real estate market is benefiting dramatically. We were one of the early players in Brazil. We loved Brazil then. We love Brazil today. The underpinnings of Brazil are very attractive. Self-sufficient in food, self-sufficient in water, self-sufficient in energy, 180 million people, growing, an educated workforce. So it has enormous, I think, future. And when we went into it a few years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, we followed a pattern that we followed in other markets. And that is that if you have a country that is close to reaching investment grade, that is the most disciplined period in the history of the country's finances. Because if they're close to investment grade, they will behave. And they will not do anything to, quote, impair reaching that, because reaching that is so significant. We rode that in Mexico. We rode that in Brazil. We're riding it in other countries. But at the same time, that enthusiasm we talked about comes back the other way. I mean, Brazil got inundated with new capital, new players, and most of them have had their ass handed to them, and to a large extent have left. We exited most of our stuff 3 or 4 years ago, and are now going back into Mexico and back into Brazil, simply because we think the underlying justifications and reasoning for your investments is there. And right now, I was recently quoted as saying, there are 3 things you can count on: death, taxes, and the European banks taking their money back from the emerging markets. And that's, and that's happening big time. So again, when you're an investor, the single most important thing you're looking for is places where your capital is in demand, where there's a premium to be achieved by, quote, taking the risk. So we're going back into Brazil for that reason. We're also building net lease warehouses in Japan. Now, as we all know, Japan isn't growing. But it turns out that Japan has a major obsolescence problem. That, to a large extent, most of its inventory of warehouses are shorter than they need to be, are smaller than they need to be, and they all have to be, quote unquote, redeveloped. And for some reason or other, the Japanese REITs are more than happy to buy the produced product at very attractive yields. But nobody is building them. So we went in there and built them and found that we had, almost unlimited demand. So by looking all over the world and attempting to identify opportunities, I think that's how you reach the conclusions. But in the end, there's got to be a justification for going forward. And growth is obviously the name of the game. I mean, we were kibitzing before about France, but if you really think about Western Europe, where we have no exposure, 0. Cheese, castles, wine, just terrific. But nobody works there. And so, how are you gonna get growth when you can't create a disciplined investment or manufacturing or business environment? So we tend to be very specific about where we play. I also think that another critical piece of the equation is scale. You might be able to be the biggest owner of office space in Uruguay, but that may be 2 buildings, and that doesn't get you anything. So it's very important when making these investments. The first question we ask before we go into any country: is it big enough to be able to create scale, which ultimately translates into creating exit? And one of the things that all of us have historically been really poor at is exit. And yet, every deal starts with, how do you get out? And so that's kind of the way we look at opportunities all over the world.
Yeah. You know, when I'm out speaking to groups, one of the things that I try to emphasize is if you're in business, particularly real estate, but in any kind of business, and you're not paying attention to what's going on in Washington, good and bad, but if you're not paying attention to what's going on, you're really not in business, because there's so many things that can affect things. You talked about liquidity, Sam, and how important that is. And last night when we were talking about there's a new tax reform proposal out from the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Republican of the Ways and Means Committee, and I started reviewing some of the items in it for Sam, and his jaw got closer and closer to the desk, because we talked about things like capital gains taxes going up, the tax on depreciation recapture on buildings going up, depreciation periods in general for all real estate, multifamily, leasehold improvements, office buildings, shopping malls, what have you, going up longer than it is today, even though buildings are deteriorating.
But Jeff,
it's
all you're describing is focus on redistribution as opposed to focus on growth.
Yeah.
These are the kind of policies that, if you implement them, levels the playing field and also eliminates the playing field.
But your jaw really hit the table when I said like-kind exchanges could be eliminated. And you talk about liquidity for real estate, right? So you take away the ability to trade property, you jack up the capital gains tax on it, you increase the amount of tax paid on depreciation recapture on sale, you lengthen the depreciation on new development. Liquidity really gets tighter in our industry. And I just think that, again, you're smart to watch Washington. I know you don't agree with much of what goes on there. We'll leave that for maybe later or
some other time.
But there's a lot going on, and I just want to make sure that people in the audience are aware of this. And what Sam talked about is a directional shifting that's going on. And there's a tremendous, for years and years and years, the Republicans in Washington felt that you needed to reward risk, reward that animalistic endeavor. And more that is going away. And the view is a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. And I think that, as you talked about how America was built and what made it was risk-taking. And so some of this is going away. So I just want to throw it out that people ought to be paying attention to Washington. It's easy to be frustrated about what we do there. I'm frustrated. I work there every day. Geez, when I started, Sam, I was 6'8", had a full head of hair. Look at me now. But it's very important, and this is just one.
Nobody disputes the importance of Washington, and nobody disputes Washington's ability to screw things up.
Yes, that is very, very true. Now, getting back to international stuff, Sam, one thing that you touched on but didn't really hit too much was China. China was sort of the flavor of the week there for a long time. Everybody wanted, we're going to go to China, we're going to go to China. But it seems like there's an awful lot of not just see-through buildings, see-through cities, right? And I just wonder, what are your thoughts now on investing in China in particular, and where do you see those, are there growth opportunities there?
First of all, we made our first investment in real estate in China 10 years ago. It turned out to be a very successful home builder. The beauty of the scenario was we put up money, the local guy listened, and we both prospered. And the reason why the local guy listened is because there was no other source of capital. Today, the amount of capital available in China for real estate is pretty unlimited. A U.S. guy coming in with $50 million or something, makes you nothing special. And when you invest anywhere where, quote, the value of your commitment isn't as valuable as in other places, I don't think you get decent results. And our experience subsequent is that we think the Chinese market has more than enough capital. There's no reason that I can think of that any U.S. developer should be going into China unless you're fulfilling a very specific niche. I mean, the only thing we're doing in China today is we're building net lease warehouses on a format that, that very, very narrow and very unique, but very limited. Other than that, I just don't see, I don't see the need for our capital, and I for sure don't see the Chinese listening to us.
Okay. We're going to invite the audience to ask questions of, I'm sure, Sam, but if you want to talk about Washington, I can do that. But so while people think of anything that they'd like to ask, at the risk, Sam, of asking something I shouldn't ask, but I'm going to because you're in the news every single day, what do you want to comment on Corvex related, the Commonwealth transaction?
A year ago, two parties, one called Related and the other a fund called Corvex, identified a REIT named Commonwealth that was trading at dramatically below its net asset value. They accumulated a position, and this was an externally managed REIT. And they accumulated a position, they owned about 10% of the company, and then they began a process of challenging the existing management. The existing management owned the outside manager and was also chairman of the board of the REIT. So the conflicts were unbelievable. The performance over the last 15 years until the activists got involved looked like the EKG of a dead person. And whereas EOP, QR, ELS all went up and all the Simon, et cetera, this thing was flat like this. The only thing that they had that was equivalent to that was the amount of fees that the manager got. So these guys took them on. They ended up in arbitration because this guy had put a provision in the charter saying that the only way a shareholder could vote or complain was they couldn't file a lawsuit, they could only go to arbitration. They had every anti-takeover provision you can think of. Anyway, the net effect of which is these guys started a process to remove the board of directors. That process of solicitation resulted in them getting 70%, but they were forced to go into arbitration, and the arbitrator got rid of the poison pills, but at the same time said you got to go resolicit. So that's what they were about to do. And these are guys who were in this to make money, and I think their original thought was they were going to liquidate the REIT. And then they came to me and said, would you be willing to stand and basically turn this thing into a market focused REIT, and without all of the terrible stuff, and make it internally managed. And we agreed not to join them, but we agreed that if they chose to support us and they were successful, we would take over the company and recreate a U.S. office REIT. And right now the solicitation is going on. I think it's supposed to end on the 20th of March, and we'll see. But this is, I did this, frankly, more as much from an evangelistic perspective as any other, because I think that externally managed REITs are horrific, and they're just completely filled with conflicts, and they shouldn't exist. And if my efforts here contribute to them not existing, I'll be thrilled and delighted.
Well, anyone can Google your comments about governance in REITs, which
Yep.
are a good 30, 25 years old, I suspect, and this
Yep.
probably goes to that.
Fits. So we'll see what happens,
Yeah.
but it should be fun.
Well, good luck, Sam. Let's see, are there any questions in the audience? Yes, sir?
First off, thank you for sharing your time with us today. Earlier you noted that optimism is key, and you want to get 70% kind of your deals done. Out of that 30% of failure, what has been one of your largest failures, and what have you learned from it?
What was my largest failure, and what was my...
And what did you learn from that?
I don't know how many transactions I've done in my lifetime, but I've certainly had both, my share of successes and my share of failures. In 1993, I bought control of a department store company in California called Carter Hawley Hale. Before we closed the deal, I had my people do a complete analysis of the company, and they came back and said the company, as a fire sale liquidation, is worth $50 million less than you're paying. As far as I was concerned, that was great news because I could now quantify my risk. 3 years later, and lots of terrible things happening, we almost went under, and we sold the business at the last minute to Federated Department Stores for $50 million less than we paid for it. So the answer is we quantified the risk, we understood the risk, and we went forward. Even though I lost $50 million on that transaction, I consider that transaction a very big success. And it was a success for the following reasons. Number one, I took a risk, and I understood the risk, and I quantified it correctly. Number two, yes, it didn't work, but unless you're willing to take risk, you can't have any winners. So from my perspective, understanding where I'm at and what my optionality is, and if that understanding is correct, that works. I mean, I did the Tribune Company. I lost $300 million. If it had worked, I would have made $5 billion. I liked that risk-reward ratio. Would I do it again? Yes, because the risk-reward ratio was appropriate. Is $300 million a reasonable amount to put at risk if the win is worth $5 billion? In my world, it is. So I don't know whether I hit exactly the focus of your question, but generally speaking, we've been very successful in a lot of things. We sold Equity Office for $39 billion. I made more than $1 billion myself. That was a great transaction. So was Carter Hawley Hale. So was the Tribune. So I think the integrity of what you do, the focus of what you do, the degree to which you understand the risk you're taking is what it's all about.
Sam's got a great line, by the way. A bank executive who has a loan officer who's never had a loss should be fired.
Absolutely. Absolutely, because it's all about risk.
Right. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
This question's actually for you, related to DC. Can you explain how you were successful in carving out the real estate from the carried interest in the recent home tax reform, house tax reform?
Well, thank you.
Why don't you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question goes to this tax reform proposal that was released last week by the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and specifically it goes to capital gains and carried interest. And I'm sure that most people in here understand this carried interest fight has been going on now for about 7 years. And the fight is basically about what your tax rate is going to be on the promote or the carry. And the public eye has been directed to private equity managers, hedge fund managers predominantly. And the argument is that they take no risk, and yet they have these high returns in excess of the capital that they personally put into a deal, and that return should be taxed as ordinary income. Now, as this debate has unfolded over the years, they've said real estate is the same thing. So a general partner in a real estate partnership who gets a promote should be taxed, under some people's theory in Washington, under ordinary income. We've been arguing, and the question is, last week when this program came out from Dave Camp, we were extremely pleased that, and this goes to what you're talking about, Sam. You have to be persistent. You have to understand the arguments. You got to make the arguments every day. You can't give up, even though the press is against you and everyone's against you on this thing, because it's very easy to demonize. But we went up for 7 years and we said,